Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the VERICI DX PLC half-year results investor presentation. Throughout this presentation, investors will be in listen-only mode. Questions are encouraged and can be submitted at any time via the Q&A tab situated on the right-hand corner of your screen. Simply type in your question and press send. The company may not be in a position to answer every question it receives during the meeting itself. However, the company will review all questions submitted today and publish responses where it's appropriate to do so. These will be available via your Investor Meet company dashboard, and we will notify you by email when these are ready for your review. I would also like to remind you that this presentation is being recorded. Before we begin, I'd like to submit this following poll. And now I'd like to hand you over to Sarah Barrington, CEO, and David Anderson, CFO. Good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon. Thanks for hosting. And then obviously I'm going to walk through the slide deck today. I'll be testing everybody on the small print, so on our disclaimer, but let's get into the meat of the presentation. For some of you, this will be a little bit of repetition, but I thought it would be helpful if we did a quick recap on who we are and what we do. And then we'll get into the results itself. So we call ourselves an immunodiagnostic company. We are focused on transplant care, and the first area of focus is kidney. The reason for that is kidney disease is a huge problem. It's a little bit of the poor relative to oncology. But I think it's emerging as an area of prime importance. You can see why with those stats from the WHO of 5 to 10 million people dying annually from kidney disease. It far surpasses even the leading cause of cancer death. We operate in the transplant area, so we're at the tail end of the process. Hopefully the more optimistic end as people get transplants as a treatment and a new lease of life, especially when you look at dialysis issues. There are about 300,000 people globally waiting for a transplant. Only about a third of those get transplanted in a year. There is a supply issue, and part of the push on that is to encourage living donations. Donors that are living are encouraged to do so because you can operate on one kidney, and the survival rates and the success rates from living rather than cadavers is higher. But to do so, they need to be encouraged that obviously transplants will be successful, and this is where we come in with our diagnostics, assisting on the transplant journey to increase patient outcomes and success of those transplants. We have 3 initial products. One is pre-transplant, that's called Clarava. The other one is for early stage, that's Tutiva. They're currently in validation studies right now, and they are due to be completed at the end of the year. Longer term, we have Protega, that's long-term survival. It addresses fibrosis, which is later stage damage, and that will remain in the clinic for another couple of years. We have licensed out of Mount Sinai, the underlying technology, and it's a fairly novel approach to this area. It uses RNA signatures to determine. And why do we do that? Well, RNA is way more dynamic than genes that tend to be set in stone. RNA is about change and real-time information. And the signatures, although primarily are focused on the immuno system for the body, also recognizes there are other biological pathways that are also important. Not only does the graft suffer damage, but you want to know how the patient is being able to cope with that. This is not just a patient outcome. Obviously, that's the most important, the graft survival, but that does have a health economic aspect to it. And that's really important as we come to look at our commercial strategy. Just a reminder on the board, there has been a change. Our founder this year, Barbara Murphy, unfortunately passed away, and she had selected a long-term collaborator to kind of step into her shoes when she was sick. This is Lorenzo Gallen. He's out of Northwestern, long-term collaborator, very familiar with technology, a leading and well-known researcher and clinician, and a great addition to our board. The advisory board remains the same, or very well known, very active. You can see there are 6 past presidents of all the major foundations and professional associations. It's a little bit of the who's who, and obviously, are now sort of doubling down with their support to us in the absence of Barbara. There's a huge enthusiasm for getting this kind of approach more readily adopted in the marketplace, both in research and commercial acceptance of the products that we're launching. For those that just need a refresher on the issues, it boils down to the clinician having a therapeutic dilemma. They're playing a balancing act. When you come to put a graft in, you've really got the administration of immunosuppressants as your main tool in the care pathway, but they're flying blind. They've got to do this balancing. If you give too much of the drug, you're suspending the entire immune system, and too much too long means that you're opening up the patient to underlying conditions such as cancer or passing infections. And obviously, in the world of COVID, this becomes even more significant as an issue. Too little, then obviously the immune system can attack the graft. They don't have very good information. Pre-transplant, there's only clinical factors. They are way too broad. They're generally ignored. And post-transplant, there are tests on the marketplace, but they're highly non-specific. So they can say and measure that there's something going on. So it measures cell-free DNA. That's the debris in the blood from some kind of infection, but they can't actually be specific and say this is happening now and it's happening in the graft. And so it's useful information, but not as useful as our information. 2 leading products, and again, that we'll be looking at the commercial launch next year. The pre-transplant is Carava. It's an RNA signature that provides a risk score. So it's very focused on the patient, the recipient of the graft, and it will give a very simple but highly significant result. Is that patient's immune system aggressive or fairly benign? If you've got an aggressive immune system, you know that you're going to need to keep that dosing high and for longer. If it's fairly benign, you have more confidence that you can taper off that dosing without, managing that through, looking to see if there's damage. So it gives the clinician very valuable information about how they're going to, set up and personalize that care pathway for that patient. Tutiva is the early stage. And again, what this is doing, it's a signature that is looking and giving the clinician real-time information. Is there damage happening? Is it in the graft and not a passing infection? And if so, what it also takes pathways such as cell repair, metabolism, etc. How well is the body coping with it? So the result is that the clinician has real-time actionable information, highly significant. Just a quick nod to the market size. The general message is it's big and it's growing. We've calculated it on these 2 leading products as our most near-term addressable market. It's about 700 million per annum, but obviously that doesn't account for the substantial growth that's happening in kidney disease, mainly because we know it's being compounded at the moment with COVID, and we need to kind of get an assessment of that to understand how much kidney disease has been promoted also with the COVID issues and complications. So let's get on to that's hopefully enough of a refresher. Who we are. Our performance of our tests was high, very actionable, very much focused on PPV, which is what's happening clinically, how relevant is it, can I take action on it? That was in the pilot. We're now into a multi-center international blinded validation study. And in the period, we were able to bring on 5 leading US centers for those lead products. And you'll see that after the period, we're now up to 12, and that covers Europe as well. We did take an additional license post-IPO for that Protega product. We had some patent protection around fibrosis, but it wasn't as on point as the one we wanted here, and we licensed that in January, and put that straight into the validation study, and that's something that will come out of, in the next few years. Obviously, with COVID, there's always a risk of your patient accrual and bringing on centres. There's lots of distraction in the marketplace. So we were delighted to announce this about the CTOP trial. That was a trial that had been done over multiple centres over a few years. It's the CTOP 19, Clinical Trials in Organ Transplant. It seeks to look at the impact of drug therapies, amongst other things. But the agreement with them, which was to help them with the processing of their study, gave us access to the control group, which was hit all the criteria for our trial, and therefore gave us some protection in our patient accrual. And we also decided to accelerate our commercial path by opening a lab in the Palmetto region for reimbursement. That's Tennessee. And appointing someone to manage the opening of that and the regulatory pathway for that clear approval. And that's, that was a full year ahead of time. At the end of the year, the half year, keep saying year, it's a half year. We had a loss that was under budget, and David will cover that later on, but we also had a very strong cash balance. Just looking in the period after the half year and to date, we did actually get our clear approval a year early, so I'm delighted to announce that. That enables our commercial plans to be a little bit more certain, a little bit more in our control. Whenever we're ready to launch post-clinical validation, we already have that in place. We are allowed to launch those tests. So that approval was extremely good news for us. The presentation says 11 sites. We've just opened another one that is now 12 sites. These are leading. We are in the US. We've got 2 in Italy, 1 in Spain, 1 in France, and we're looking to the UK sites to open shortly. We did complete our patient enrolment for the first 2 leading tests. As I said, there are 3 in the trial. The first 2 have been enrolled now. We did that early. That was tremendous news as we are in COVID times, and a lot of trials were delayed or had slow enrollment. So we were very proud of our centres for being fast on onboarding, and also very focused on their patient enrolment. We do need to wait to the endpoints, and that will be at the end of the year. So looking forward, when you look at our milestones, we are looking to be able to analyze all of that data and publish, submit for publication, and give the performance metrics at the end of Q1 of next year. These are our milestones. So what I've done here is I've taken something that we issued at IPO. Obviously shown in grey that we've completed those that we have completed early. The point of this is to say anything within our control, we are trying to deliver early so that we can support anything that's outside of our control, those milestones being on time. And that is the overall message from us at the moment, is that we are on track. Looking forward to next year, coming out of the R&D phase for those 2 lead products and into laying down the foundations and commercially launching. That's the activity of next year, and you'll see more announcements on that as we go forward. David, can I just hand over to you to do the financial pages?
Sure. Thank you, Sarah. Good afternoon, everybody. So our reported loss for the period of 2.9 million, but an adjusted EBITDA loss of 2.5. As Sarah mentioned earlier, that was slightly below our expectations. And if I can use the analogy that whilst we we spent a bit longer on the runway, but since takeoff, our ascent has been slightly steeper. In terms of that adjusted EBITDA of 2.5, just under 800,000 on employee costs. At the end of the period, we had 8 full-time employees. Currently got 10 full-time employees. The laboratory and development costs, that's the cost of the trials to date. That does not include any labor cost. That is pure external cost. And then professional costs and other costs. The biggest item in the other costs is the rent that we pay on our lab in New York and in Tennessee. Just moving over to, oh, excuse me. Sorry, we're competing for the slides. I will take control. There we go. Thank you. So balance sheet, our intangible assets as the license cost. We do not capitalize any development cost in that. That is just the pure cost of the licenses and the related fees in their maintenance and improvement. Cash, as Sarah mentioned also earlier, that's a bit more positive than we were expecting, but that goes back to my earlier comment that we took a bit longer to take off, if you will. Into the other debtors and other liabilities, that's principally prepayments and accruals, mainly accruals for clinical trials. And then just in terms of the share capital, just a point to note that the options outstanding are 14.5 million, of which 10.6 have fully vested. Moving on to the cash flows. So cash used in operations, 2.8 million, being the 2.5 referred to earlier, and about 300,000 of working capital movement. Purchase of tangibles, biggest spend there was on a net sequencer. And then the intangible assets is the costs of the ongoing work on patents. Bit of a foreign exchange bump because of the strength of sterling against the dollar, giving us an ending balance of about 14.5 million. Thank you, Sarah. Back to you.
Thank you. And then as we just look at summarizing our philosophy as a diagnostic company, just before we go into Q&A, just a reminder that, you know, with diagnostic companies, the days of just having good science and presenting it to the market and hoping that it would be sufficient are long gone. You really do need to start there, and we do have very clearly differentiated technology. And when we talk about the commercial strategy, I will come back to that. You know, we have something that's useful. It does improve patient outcomes. It really does inform the therapeutic protocol, and we are seeing, you know, a very strong response to the so what question. You never do anything alone. We do have some very key partnerships, and we are expanding upon that. And you'll see more news on that as, you know, towards the end of the year. And obviously, we do have an efficient path on the regulatory. You know, the clearance already done on the clear. We don't need FDA. We can choose to go down that route at a later stage. There are a number of advantages or potential advantages, but as we all know, the FDA is a little bit overstretched with COVID at the moment. And so being able to go down this pathway of an LDT is enormously helpful. The good news for us is when we opened up our lab in the Tennessee region, being in the Palmetto region for reimbursement for Medicare, it was proven to be a very good choice. In April of this year, they gave what they call a local coverage determination. This is a precursor decision. We do not have to go and prove to this region that it's a useful test for the Tutiva. They've already predetermined that this area is useful, and any diagnostic that replaces a biopsy will be covered already. So that was a huge bump in our accelerated path there, and obviously a reduction in future costs. So that choice of opening up in that region was well supported by that determination earlier this year. And we clearly have a competitive advantage. Our science and our approach means that we've got real-time and actionable, useful information in an environment that is looking to have more personalized information for the patients. So I'm just going to stop it there in the summary so that we can get into Q&A. And maybe I can just jump straight into the questions. So I have a question. Can you elaborate further on the commercial opportunities? So one of the things that I'm very pleased about in this area is that when we come and we turn out of being an R&D company into a commercial operation, we are not having to do a huge sales force. There are about between 230 and 250 transplant centers in the US, and that's mirrored about in the EU. Which means that when we come to launch these products, we are talking to transplant centers, and therefore it's much more of a business to business. We need a highly developed team that can go in and present to the C-suite, not only the clinical and patient outcomes, but also the health economics and the commercial advantages to the transplant centers for adopting this technology. So first of all, it's much more of a targeted play. Secondly, our major competitor in the US is a company called CareDx. I'm sure you're all familiar with them. They did the heavy lift from transplant care from tissue into blood. And they are very well aware that our science is very solid and is competitive to them. But we have an opportunity to capitalize on the hard work that they have done, which is moving the interest into blood by coming along with just a better test. So in terms of the commercial opportunities, we will look very early next year into utility studies and early opportunities from the early adopters, sites and folks that have been following us for a number of years. And then we'll build upon that to a much more kind of mature commercial strategy after that. Did you see your future growth coming through organic means, or do you see M&A playing any part? The honest answer is a bit of both, and both are strengthened by a strategy in each area. So obviously, we will be building up our presence and going to the transplant centers ourselves. But there are opportunities to collaborate with others to accelerate that. And there are also opportunities to look down the M&A pathway, both as a target and as an acquirer. Part of our strategy is to become the clinician's platform of choice. And to do that, it's not just our technologies we're looking at, but others, to be able to support the idea that we solve the clinician's major problems. And so I think a combination of the two is likely in our strategy. And then can I briefly explain what alternative solutions there are? This is the competitive field. So for Clarava, there's nothing. There's no information given. They use clinical factors that are way too broad. And so that's a good news story in terms of we have no competitors, but obviously we have to build the case that that's a useful piece of information. So that's Clarava. Tutiva, as I said, there are the three major players in this area are cell-free DNA technologies. That's the debris in the body, the high MPV non-specific. That's CareDx, Natera, and Eurofins. And they have been out there for a number of years with that technology. Number of problems already highly documented. And we believe that we have, although we're competitive, we have a different approach that sets us aside. And we have a focus on highly specific, actionable data. And I think that that gives us the clear competitive advantage that we're looking at. There are a number of emerging technologies coming out in this area, recognizing the need to take a different approach. We are seeing a number of progressions in urine-based testing in this area. We've got some ways to go in terms of their proof points, but it's an interesting area, and I think very interesting in terms of looking at the at-home testing market, rather than the transplant care. So, I would say that they're additive to the whole solution, very helpful in patient care, not necessarily directly competitive. Can I explain a little bit more how the validation studies work? Sure. So with a multi-center blinded trial, what you are doing is you're putting your test to work and you're looking for a comparator. And you're looking for two things. One, how does the test perform? That's your sensitivity and specificity against the comparator. So for Clarava, clearly there's no comparator. So we have to wait for outcome, and we use a 6-month outcome. Within that time, there's either an event or no event, but that early pre-transplant information is therefore tested by outcome. And then Tutiva is compared to a 3-month biopsy. It's the early stage damage. And obviously, the standard of the care, which is the serum creatinine, this is about 30% of all cases. So we decided to use biopsy as the higher comparator. And that will test the performance of our test against other approaches in the area. And then you're looking at what we call PPV and MPV, and that takes account of, okay, it's not so much the comparator, but how would this perform in the clinic, where essentially you're looking at an instance rate. And so an MPV is usually determined to be a rule-out test. Years ago, I worked on prostate cancer. That was highly significant. You're looking to give the clinician a reason to say, no, don't do biopsy, right? You can wait and see. So that's a rule-out test. Kidney transplant's not like that. We're really knowing that there's a high instance rate, up to 50% of all organs have an event. So you're looking for something that's got a high prevalence, and you're looking for a good reason to say something's going on and you need to do something about it. So that's the point of the validation studies. And obviously we collect the information from at the moment 12 sites. We're hoping to be 15 or more. But I think for Clarava and Tutiva, as we've finished those sites, it will be 12 sites, collect it all together, and then look at it overall so that that's representative of what will happen in real clinical life. So that's how the validation studies work, and then you publish on it. Next question is, if Clarava and Tutiva become successful products, how long would it take to potentially transfer the technology to other organ transplants? The answer is potentially not long either. Clearly we do look at other disease areas, and this is a very broad approach. We are seeing it being not only to other transplants, other organ transplants, but to other disease groups as well. And realistically, because they're about the very early stage, then when you're in a validation study, your endpoints are quite close. And so you can see that expansion happening in a relatively short period of time. We're not talking about needing to do a 5-year study. So I hope that answered that question.
Hi, Sarah. Well, I think you've addressed all the questions for investors today. And of course, the company will review any further questions submitted and publish responses where it's appropriate to do so. Sarah, I just wondered, before redirecting investors for feedback, if I could ask you for a few closing comments.
Absolutely. So I've got to say that it's probably going to be a reassuringly boring message, is how I would put it. The company has made a philosophy of anything that we can control, we'd like to deliver early if at all possible, because underpinning that is things that we can't control, and we'd like to be on track. And so far, that's exactly what's happening. In difficult COVID times, we've been early with our patient enrolment, and we are on track for that end of the year completion of the validation. We've been early with our clear approval, so that, again, when we're ready to commercially launch, we will do that. The other reassuring message is that we are very focused. Although we've been doing things early, we've been very focused on our cash management. We have preserved cash so that we have a nice long runway, and we have cash for other opportunities which would support that commercial launch next year. And we have a very heavy eye on that and platform expansion. So a reassuringly boring message is we are on track.
Sarah, David, thanks again for updating investors today. Could I please ask investors not to close the session, as you'll now be automatically redirected for the opportunity to provide your feedback in order that the management team can better understand your views and expectations. This will only take a few minutes to complete, but is greatly valued by the company. On behalf of the management team of VERICI DX PLC, we'd like to thank you for attending today's presentation. That now concludes today's session, and good afternoon to you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.